In this next video, we're going to stylize our links. When we go to our page, we see that our web browser has some default colors. Quite often it's sort of this medium blue for a link that's available. You'll notice this link is purple, and that means it's been visited before. So there are some default colors, and you'll see the underline is also a property, a style property that is a default. So we're going to change some of those things, and we can do that in our style sheet. Now before we get going, I'm going to teach you how to write what's called a comment. Now in our HTML page, comments were written with an open angle bracket, exclamation, and then we had our comment here, and then we close it. Now that works in HTML. I think we did one, where was it? Right here. And you'll notice that Dreamweaver sort of grays it out to give you a clue that it's a comment. But that's not the formatting of a comment that is in the code but doesn't show up in the page. That's not how we do comments in CSS. All right, so we're not going to follow that. To write a comment, you need to have a forward-leaning slash mark with an asterisk. That opens the comment. You'll notice now everything below it is commented out. And then to close it, you'll have another asterisk with another forward-leaning slash. Now in here you can write anything you want. I just wrote CSS document. This really is just a note to somebody reading the style sheet. It doesn't really have any application towards what it's not going to affect anything else with what's going on the page. So the reason why I bring that up is I'm going to come down to the bottom of my style sheet after the block quote, and I'm going to add a comment. So I'm going to have the open and the close, and then I'm going to call this link styles. Create another space, and then using the equal sign, I'm going to sort of draw this little formatting of a line. Let me put some returns so you can see that a little bit better. So what I've done here is sort of just give myself a way to say, hey, here's where I'm styling all my links. But this really doesn't affect anything on the page. It's really information for me. And I just did, you can have anything in between these, so it doesn't really matter what you have as long as you close the comments. So I'm using a comment tag to sort of manage and organize my CSS page. Some CSS pages they become several hundred lines long. And so by breaking it up into little sections and having little comment titles for your sections is just a little tool that you can use. Otherwise, all of these styles just run in a row. Okay, so when we have links, there are actually 5 states to a link. And I'm going to go ahead and create them all, and we could stylize our links just by everything being an A. That would be what we would call the selector. So A is the selector for a link. But links have different properties. For one, when you see a link on the page, there's just sort of the static link that's sitting there. There can also be a hover effect. There also can be a tabbing effect. There can be a visiting effect. And there can be another thing that's called active. What does the link do as you actually click on it? So we're going to create all those what we call states of our link using what's called a pseudo selector. So instead of just styling all links the same, all 5 states of the link to do the same thing, I'm going to put a colon here and have link. This is a known pseudo selector. I'm going to create another pseudo selector for what does my link look like when it's visited. I'm going to create another one for the focus, and then another one for hover, And then the last one is active. So generally you want to stylize all 5 states. Focus is a way that people can tab if they're using a device that doesn't, like let's say somebody doesn't have use of their hands. So they might have a way to hit a button, maybe they use their nose or their elbow to be able to tab, but they don't have the dexterity to use a mouse and actually hover over the mouse and click on it. So the way they navigate links is they have to tab over to the link. So what does it look like when something is in focus? So if you're wondering what that means, that's what it is. So the first thing I'm going to do with my link here is I'm going to stylize the color. And by the way, having this one first is really important because all of these will inherit what you set in this first style. So the first thing I want to set is the color. I happen to have some colors picked out. This one's a gold. Notice that it shows gives you a preview of that color in Dreamweaver before you set it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save. I'm not going to change any of these yet, but let's just see what this does. So we hit refresh, and now everything that was blue is now gold, that FF90, except for this visited link. All right, so it's usually a good idea for your visited link to have a slightly different color than maybe what you had before. It doesn't have to be entirely different. It can be really close, but maybe just slightly different, so it gives some clue that it's different. So this gold, let's see if I get a hover, it's really close to this one, isn't it? But this one should be brighter. And I could maybe even play with that more. And this almost starts fading it. That's maybe, yeah, I can't really go any darker. So maybe I'd have to go with the 9 and dull it. I can make it sort of like a darker orange. So if I visited, but generally speaking, if you've been to a web page, if it fades a little bit more, it gets a little bit lighter, that lets you know that it's been visited. So that's just, you can have a different strategy of that. I'm going to try this and just see what we get. So I'll hit save and I'll do a refresh. And it's not a whole lot different than what the actual link is. But that's okay. I'm going to just leave it at that for now. Another thing we have here is we're going to have the color for the focus, and I'm going to choose black or near black, and I'm actually going to choose the same for hover, which actually makes sense. So if the color change for a focus or a hover, people are in essence you're doing the same thing. You're just highlighting the text. And it hasn't been clicked on yet, but it lets them know that it can be clicked on. So let's change that, and let's refresh and see what happens. So now as I hover over, it changes to a darker color. So that gives people just a reassurance that, hey, this is a link, and if I click on it, it's probably going to do something. So it did it down there and does it up here, and these are all pretty universal. Now, one thing about the contrast of the color I chose is if I converted this to grayscale, this would maybe be about a 40% gray against a white background. It's barely enough contrast, but if I wanted to make more contrast so people can read the text, especially if it's in content, it can be hard to read. One of the strategies I can have is to bold it. So I'm going to come back up here, and I'm going to change the font weight. And there's options here. This is really sort of like a percentage, and I'm just going to go and choose bold. You could play around and see what it does. The effects will vary based upon what font you have. Now that we aren't changing impact, it's still Times New Roman. So you would have to play around and just see what each of those levels of font weight does for each type of font. All right, so we'll go ahead and hit save and refresh. So that makes it stand out a little bit better. Now if I click on it, it just stays black right now. So I can change that as well by changing the active. So maybe as they click on it, it goes back to the original color. I would make sure you've got something here, and making it the same as the link can sometimes be a good plan. So we'll refresh that. So as I hover, I click, and as I click, notice it changed to that color. And it drops me down. All right, so as I click it, it changes back to yellow. So that's the active color. Let's change this underline. By default, it has what we have called a text decoration. So in the link, by default, it has underline. I'm going to choose none when it's an active link. Then on the hover and the focus, I'm going to change that to underline. Do the same thing for hover. Now could I combine a hover and a focus into one style? You could do something like this, comma, a hover, and it doesn't matter if there's a line return or, I collapsed. It wouldn't matter if there's a line return or if you had them in a single line. All right, I could do this and take that one out as long as I have them both covered. So what's happening here is no matter what, focus and hover will always have the same styles. It just saves some line of code and you have fewer places to edit if you make changes. Notice I didn't have a semicolon there. Better make sure I have that before we do this. So what should happen now is the links should not have an underline until we either focus or hover over it. So let's go take a look. Hit refresh, and there we go. So the underlines are gone, but they show up as I hover. And even as I click, the line stays there. Why does it do that? Because my active is inheriting the text decoration from these styles above. That's the cascading styles. If I didn't want active to have the underline, I could either change the text decoration to say none, or I could move active to be above focus and hover. Generally speaking, as I do my links, this is the order of the pseudo selectors that I do. And that's really it. That's how we stylize some very basic elements to our links.